What if I told you that behind the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire, beyond the towering minarets that pierce the sky, beyond the mosaic tiled gardens dripping with jasmine, and beyond the golden palaces that shimmered in the Anatolian sun, there existed a secret world, a world shrouded in silken veils and forbidden whispers, not of sultans or soldiers, not of harems filled with veiled women, but of something far more provocative and far more hidden. This isn't just a forgotten footnote in dusty old scrolls. This is a chapter of history that pulses with desire, power, beauty, betrayal, and a truth so strange it feels like fiction. Behind the marble walls of Topkapi Palace, young boys, some barely 8 or 9, were handpicked, not just for intelligence or strength, but for something far more delicate, their beauty. These boys were not soldiers, they weren't servants, they were male concubines, groomed, adored, displayed, and then just as quickly discarded, forgotten, like fading perfume in the air. But make no mistake, in the Ottoman court these boys weren't cloaked in shame, they were flaunted, paraded like rare gems, reflections of a man's taste, sophistication, and status. They were the pride of the elite, the soft edge of masculine power, and in a world where conquest and cruelty reigned, they represented something dangerously intimate. Control not just over armies, but over hearts. This story will leave you stunned, because the truth is, when we talk about harems, our minds instinctively picture silken cushions, veiled women, and lustful sultans. But that's only one side of the coin. What if I told you that the Ottoman harem had a mirror, a quieter, less talked about world, where men kept other men for beauty, for company, and yes, for love? This wasn't unique to the Ottomans. Across ancient Persia, classical Greece, dynastic China, the most powerful courts had always housed young male companions, groomed not just for pleasure but for prestige. And in the Ottoman Empire, this custom evolved into something elaborate, ritualistic, and deeply political. The young men, known as yamaks, were symbols of elite status. Their presence wasn't hidden in shadows. It was normalized, even celebrated. To be seen with a beautiful youth at your side was not a scandal. It was a compliment, a display of wealth, refinement, and control. But here's the catch. Being cherished didn't mean being safe. Behind every smile lay a shadow. Behind every embroidered silk robe was a cage. Take, for instance, the haunting tale of Tahir and Tib, 2 young Ottomans captured by Christian noblemen. You'd expect chains, dungeons, cruelty. Instead, their captors fell in love with them. And for a fleeting moment in time it seemed love had transcended religion, politics, and culture. These boys were showered with gifts, bathed in affection. But fairy tales in the real world never last long, and when society caught wind of their bond, punishment followed with ruthless precision. Shame, imprisonment, separation. Their love, while pure, was called perverse. And this, dear listener, is where the paradox begins. Because while the empire publicly celebrated the presence of beautiful boys, it never fully embraced the love that sometimes followed. In private, hearts fluttered. In public, silence ruled. So what really happened behind those palace walls? The Ottoman Empire, stretching from the Balkans to the deserts of Arabia, was one of the most complex, sophisticated empires in history. Under sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent, its influence spanned art, architecture, military innovation, and political theory. But underneath that imperial might was a softer empire, an empire of emotions, of hidden desires. It began early. Boys from conquered lands, Slavic, Caucasian, Balkan, were taken into the imperial court, selected for their beauty, their grace, and their potential. They were not treated as common slaves, but as investments. The chosen few were brought into the palace, where they would be trained in the most delicate arts, music, poetry, philosophy, politics, and how to please. These boys were housed in gender-specific quarters, under the constant watch of senior officials. The Venetian envoy Benedetto Ramberti once wrote in Fascination that up to 500 youths, aged between 8 and 20, lived within the palace. They are, he said, the delight of the signor. They were not allowed to leave, not until they had passed through the long ritual of court grooming, not until their beauty faded, or they were deemed worthy of public office. The training was exhaustive. They were expected to walk gracefully, speak with elegance, entertain the powerful, and remain charming, even in silence. But beneath the glitter and charm was a deeper question. Were they free? The Ottomans didn't define sexuality as we do today. There was no gay or straight binary. Instead, relationships were classified by roles, the dominant and the passive. A man could love another man, so long as he maintained the masculine role, the powerful one, the giver. And this framework allowed male-male relationships to flourish in a way that confounds our modern understanding. Janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers, also had relationships with young companions. These bonds, while often physical, were also emotional. In many ways, these boys were the closest thing to a wife a man of rank could have in a male-dominated hierarchy. For many of the boys, this was salvation. They came from poverty, from villages ravaged by war. To be chosen meant a chance at education, luxury, and even political power. Some were granted tax exemptions. Some eventually rose to prominent roles in the court. To outsiders, this may have looked like a dream. But ask yourself, when your beauty is your currency, what happens when it fades? Because behind the silken walls of the palace, time was a predator, and no one escaped it. Imagine waking up every morning in the heart of a palace, surrounded by fountains that sang in marble courtyards, gardens blooming in the colours of spring, and silk garments laid out for you by servants trained to please. It sounds like paradise. But for the Amaks, the beautiful boys of the Ottoman court, it was a golden prison. Their world was wrapped in luxury, yes, but it was also ruled by silence, by surveillance, and by unspoken expectations. These boys were handpicked, not just for their features but for their ability to adapt, to survive in a system that both cherished and consumed them. They were taught music not simply to entertain, but to seduce. Poetry, not for enlightenment, but to express longing, often toward the men who owned them. To walk through the palace halls was to walk a tightrope. One wrong word, one misstep, and the dream could end in disgrace. Or worse. You see, while they were groomed for companionship, they were also being tested. Trained like dancers, actors, and diplomats all at once. They learned to serve in ways the public would never see. Behind closed doors they were ornaments, possessions, sometimes lovers, but rarely were they truly free. The Sultan himself oversaw much of this hidden order. He had the final say on their placement, their future, their fate. A raised brow from the Sultan could mean a boy was elevated to a seat of power. A sigh of boredom could banish him to obscurity. They say that in the imperial court nothing went unnoticed, especially beauty. It was a currency more valuable than gold, and these boys, they were the mint. But as much as they were prized, they were also replaceable. When a boy's beauty began to fade, even slightly, the whispers would begin. He's grown older, they'd say, his light has dimmed. And just like that, a favourite could fall from grace. Some were dismissed from the palace with a stipend and sent to faraway provinces, offered government jobs as a final reward. Others weren't so lucky. Their names faded from records. Their faces disappeared from paintings, as if they had never existed at all. But not all relationships were transactional. Some, like the story of Tahir and Tib, were born from genuine affection. Let's return to them. These two boys from the empire captured by Christian noblemen during a time of war. What began as captivity turned into something strange and powerful. Their captors, instead of breaking them, fell in love with them, and Tahir and Tib, boys raised in the strict rituals of the Ottoman court, felt something they had never known before: freedom. Emotional, terrifying freedom. They were no longer being admired for duty, they were loved. But society has a cruel way of punishing what it doesn't understand. When the relationship came to light, both Christian and Muslim worlds recoiled. Love between two men, especially across enemy lines, was too much for even the most liberal minds. Tahir and Tib were imprisoned, accused of sodomy, their lovers beaten, humiliated, tossed into cells. It wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a symbol, a warning. The empire was changing. In earlier centuries, these relationships, rural while private, had a place in the social fabric. They were written about in poems, referenced in courtly gossip, even joked about in elite circles. The Ottomans, unlike their European neighbours, had never fully criminalized same-sex relationships. They viewed sexuality not as identity, but as behavior, and as long as a man remained dominant, active, he retained his status, even if his lover was a boy. But by the 18th century, the empire had begun to bend under the weight of Western influence. European ambassadors, scholars, and missionaries brought more than treaties and trade. They brought new ideas about morality, gender, propriety. Slowly, Ottoman elites began to adopt these perspectives. Shame crept into the corners where celebration once lived. Homosexuality was no longer poetic. It was now perverse. Public displays of affection between men, once overlooked, became scandalous. The boys of the court, once admired for their elegance, were now seen as threats to decency. And then came the moment that changed everything: the Penal Code of 1858. This new law, heavily influenced by French civil codes, made acts against public modesty punishable by imprisonment. While it didn't explicitly outlaw homosexuality, it gave the state the power to police it, especially when visible, and the consequences were brutal. In Istanbul, men were beaten in the streets by state-sponsored moral patrols. Some were dragged into public squares, their heads shaved in shame. Others were assaulted, not just physically, but symbolically. The goal was humiliation, erasure, fear. The message was clear. The era of velvet affection was over. Some whispered that even the Sultan feared the backlash, that he quietly dismissed many of the remaining yamaks, that portraits were burned, poetry censored, entire wings of the palace repurposed, as if to erase the memory of what had been. But even in this atmosphere of rising hostility, not everyone surrendered. Tahir and Tib, remember them. After months in prison, the boys were released, but their lovers remained behind bars. Desperate to reunite, the Christian noblemen escaped. They converted to Islam, a bold, dangerous move, hoping that by joining the Ottoman faith they could be accepted as partners. It was a final gamble, an act of reckless, raw devotion, and yet, it wasn't enough. The tide of change could not be stopped. The golden age of the male beloved had ended. By the late 19th century, women had replaced boys in the public eye. Beauty, once fluid, androgynous, strange, was now redefined. Heterosexual love became the new ideal. The poetry changed, the songs shifted, the history books went silent. Ottoman historian Ahmed Cevdet Pasha wrote with sadness, "Woman lovers have increased in number while boy beloveds have decreased. It is as if the people of Lot have been swallowed by the earth." He was witnessing the death of an era that dared to celebrate male beauty, that allowed power and affection to dance together in candlelit rooms, that gave poor boys the chance to become princes, even if just for a season. To truly understand the world of the yamaks, we have to step beyond politics, beyond laws, beyond the gilded gates of the palace. We must enter the hearts of those boys, hand-picked, polished, placed into a system that revered them, desired them, and eventually discarded them. Who were they when the lights dimmed, when the flutes fell silent, when the courtiers stopped watching? They were children, many taken from remote villages, often in the Balkans, the Caucasus, or parts of Eastern Europe. Some were orphans, others were sold by desperate families in exchange for promises of protection and prosperity. They were renamed, re-educated, refashioned into perfect courtly companions, their old lives erased, their new roles carefully scripted. In the halls of the palace, these boys had to learn fast. Every glance, every step, every breath was watched. They were not just expected to serve, they were expected to enchant. Their bodies were seen as instruments of status. Their presence was a reflection of a man's influence, taste, and refinement. For the powerful men who kept them, viziers, generals, poets, even sultans, these boys offered more than pleasure. They offered prestige. In an empire where conquest meant everything, controlling desire became another form of domination. But while older men basked in the admiration of their companions, the boys themselves were trapped in a game they didn't design. A dangerous, delicate game of court intrigue. Because in the palace, jealousy could be deadly. The higher a boy rose in favour, the more enemies he made. Other courtiers would whisper behind screens, plot behind fans. A misplaced word, a too bold glance, a lover scorned, and a boy could vanish without explanation. Many did. Some were sent away quietly, stripped of their titles. Others met darker fates, their names lost to time. After all, they were beautiful, not powerful. Their influence was borrowed, and once the man who loved them turned cold, their protection melted with it. Still, not all tales ended in tragedy. Some boys rose through the ranks. A select few managed to use their charm and education to secure roles in the bureaucracy, even the military. There were yamaks who became governors, diplomats, and scholars. These were the lucky ones, those who learned to turn affection into leverage. They knew the secret. In the Ottoman court, survival wasn't about strength, it was about adaptation, the ability to play multiple roles, the innocent, the loyal, the seductive, the strategic. If a boy could become all things to all men, he had a chance. But even for the most clever, love was a double-edged sword. Because while the empire may have accepted relationships between men, true emotional intimacy was always dangerous. To feel was to risk. To love deeply, not just perform affection, but to mean it, was to open a door that could never be shut. Take the stories preserved in Ottoman poetry. They speak of boys with jasmine eyes and honeyed voices, of gazes held too long in moonlit gardens, of longing that burned hotter than the Anatolian sun. These weren't just lustful verses, they were emotional confessions hidden in metaphor. In one anonymous poem, a vizier writes, "His lips were a garden of pomegranate, and I a bee lost in spring. I drank too deeply, and now I thirst forever." It's not hard to imagine what that meant. Love, in a place built on power, was a form of rebellion. It blurred the lines, it threatened the order, and yet it existed. It thrived, even in secret. You might ask, was this world cruel, or was it, in its own way, revolutionary? The answer isn't simple. On one hand, the yamaks were objectified, groomed to please, denied the innocence of youth. On the other, they lived lives many could only dream of: luxury, education, attention. For some, it was a golden escape from poverty. For others, a beautiful prison. They were not slaves in the traditional sense, but neither were they free. The paradox of their existence is what makes this history so haunting. In a world where men dominated every structure, the military, the court, the religion, these boys were allowed a peculiar kind of power, soft power, emotional power. But it came with a price. As the empire modernized and Western ideas took hold, this system, this delicate balance, began to collapse. The 19th century brought with it an entirely new framework for understanding gender and sexuality. Western colonial powers began exporting not just laws and factories, but ideologies. In the West, same-sex desire had become pathologized, treated as sickness, sin, or scandal. And the Ottoman elite, desperate to be seen as civilized in the eyes of Europe, began to internalize these beliefs. Suddenly, what had once been open was now hidden. What had once been sung about in gardens was now whispered behind locked doors. Artists stopped painting yamaks. Poets turned their pens toward women. Lovers erased their own memories. This transformation wasn't just legal, it was cultural. The Ottoman psyche was shifting. The male beloved was no longer a symbol of refinement. He was now a relic of a decadent, uncivilized past. But not everyone was willing to forget. The tale of Tahir and Tib, once whispered among court servants, began to resurface in modern retellings. Historians, working with fragments, letters, poetry, diplomatic records, slowly pieced together the truth, and what they found was shocking. Tahir and Tib's captors, having risked everything to escape Christian prisons and convert to Islam, hoped to live openly in the Ottoman world. But by the time they returned, it had changed. The empire was no longer the same. Their reunion was brief. Official records don't say much, just that they vanished from public life. Some say they fled to the outer provinces, living quietly in anonymity. Others believe they were separated by force. There is even a rumour, whispered in academic circles, that one of them joined a Sufi order, devoting his life to spiritual love. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Their story didn't end with them. It became legend. A quiet resistance against the tide of shame. As the 19th century marched on, the Ottoman Empire found itself caught between two worlds. One was the grandeur of its Islamic and imperial heritage, a place where beauty, devotion and desire had long intermingled behind veiled curtains. The other was the looming shadow of Europe with its steamships, factories, and moral codes. And it was in this clash, between East and West, between tradition and reform, that the golden age of the male beloved began to crumble. Reform came under many banners: modernization, diplomacy, civilization. But beneath these polished slogans was something more invasive, a reprogramming of cultural identity. European advisors now sat at the Sultan's table, Christian missionaries established schools in Istanbul, French novels were read in palace libraries, and slowly the West's discomfort with male intimacy bled into Ottoman society. What had once been poetic became perverse. Where once a vizier might compose an ode to a boy with tulip cheeks and almond eyes, now he dared not speak. Where once musicians sang of moonlit embraces between men, those songs were either rewritten or banned. By the 1850s, the unspoken law had become very clear. Desire between men would be tolerated no longer. And then came the hammer blow, the Ottoman Penal Code of 1858. Heavily influenced by the Napoleonic Code, this law criminalized public behavior deemed shameful or contrary to modesty. It did not name homosexuality directly. But everyone knew what it meant. Suddenly, acts of affection between men, even a lingering touch, a too soft glance, could result in arrest, fines, or worse. And the punishment wasn't only legal, it was public, it was performative. In the capital, men suspected of forbidden love were dragged through the streets, their heads shaved, their robes torn. They were paraded as warnings, not just to others like them, but to the empire itself. The message was unmistakable. The old ways are gone. Some tried to fight back. Secret gatherings were held. Letters were written in coded language. A few brave poets refused to change their verses, but resistance was fragile. The empire itself was weakening. Economically strained, militarily pressured, and politically fractured, it could no longer afford cultural ambiguity. It wanted order, morality, control. The Sultan, once the silent protector of these palace traditions, now faced a different kind of court, one filled with European diplomats, conservative advisors, and an increasingly religious bureaucracy. The boys of the inner palace, once praised as the gems of the court, were slowly phased out. Their quarters were emptied, their names vanished from the scrolls, their portraits removed from the walls. But even as the palace turned away, the past refused to disappear entirely. Whispers of the Amaks remained in old poems, half-erased paintings, foreign diaries. Venetian travellers who once described youths more radiant than the stars now returned to Europe with stories of moral decline and political fear. In private, older men mourned, not just the boys, but the freedom they had once embodied, because the world of the male beloved had never only been about sex or aesthetics. It had been a realm where emotion dared to flourish in the most forbidden of places. In a world of arranged marriages, political unions, and gender-segregated society, the Amaks offered something intoxicating: companionship with vulnerability. Real love, however fragile, however fleeting. But now, even that was gone. A silence fell over the empire, not just literal, but cultural. Stories that once brought pride now caused shame. Where a vizier once celebrated his relationship with a favourite boy, he now wrote of propriety, religion, and the family unit. The boys, once immortalised in verse, became phantoms. And yet, in the most hidden corners of the empire, some clung to the old ways. In the rural provinces, especially among Sufi mystics, the spiritual tradition of same-sex affection lived on. Sufi poetry had always embraced divine love in all its forms, and for many this included the beauty of young men as symbols of God's perfection. In candlelit gatherings, disciples still recited verses from Rumi and Hafiz, poems that described the male form not as temptation, but as a mirror of the divine. The Amaks were gone from the palace, yes, but in these sacred circles their memory lingered. It's no coincidence that as political space shrank, mystical space expanded. The more the empire tried to regulate love, the more it slipped into metaphor, symbol, secret. And that brings us once more to Tahir and Tib. Their story, almost mythic in its beauty and defiance, had not yet ended. After their captors converted to Islam in a desperate attempt to reunite, Tahir and Tib vanished from public record. For years, historians believed they had been lost, swallowed by shame, imprisoned, or worse, but fragments surfaced. Letters, signed only with initials, describing two men living in a small Anatolian village, far from the reach of Istanbul. They were said to keep to themselves, to host guests only during certain nights, to play music none of the locals recognized. Some believe they found peace, others believe they died in fear. But what matters more is that they dared. They dared to love in a time when love had been weaponized. They dared to reclaim the softness the empire had once celebrated, and then tried to destroy. They were the last echoes of a fading song, and in their defiance they left behind a message, that even in a world built on power and obedience, there are places, quiet, secret, sacred, where passion can survive. Today the Ottoman Empire is gone. Its palaces are now museums, its scrolls kept behind glass, and yet its secrets still whisper. In a mosaic tile, in a forgotten verse, in a face captured on canvas, eyes downcast, lips slightly parted, waiting for someone to remember. Because history isn't only shaped by battles and treaties, it's shaped by the things we try hardest to erase, the things that make us uncomfortable, the things that don't fit the story we want to tell, and perhaps that's why the tale of the Yamaks matters. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was tragic, but because it was true. History doesn't end, it fades. It drifts into the cracks between what was remembered and what was deliberately forgotten. And if you listen closely, if you press your ear against the stones of old palaces or the pages of old poems, you might still hear it breathing. The story of the Yamaks, the boys of beauty, brilliance and burden in the Ottoman court, is not just about desire, it's about power, about how empires use beauty to elevate, control and discard, and about what happens to those beautiful things once they're no longer convenient. By the late 1800s, Istanbul had become a very different place than it was in the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. Trams clattered through narrow streets, telegraphs buzzed with European messages, Western suits replaced Ottoman robes, and with this transformation came a deep discomfort with anything that did not align with the civilized image the empire now desperately wanted to present. Male beauty, male love, male vulnerability. These had no place in the new order. A cultural amnesia took hold. Poets began writing about veiled women and domestic virtue. Artists shifted their brushes toward landscapes and still lifes. The Yamaks, once the muses of a generation, were now unspoken. Ghosts whose faces were scrubbed from frescoes, whose stories were buried under shame. But history is stubborn. It finds ways to surface. In the margins of old manuscripts, a scribe might scrawl a forgotten name. In the private diary of a European diplomat, a scandalous encounter is described in hushed tones. In a Sufi lodge in Konya, a devotee recites a 17th century verse about a boy whose voice trembled like a reed in wind. You can ban the body, you cannot erase the memory, and the memory, when recovered, asks us uncomfortable questions. What kind of empire so boldly celebrates desire, only to punish it later? What kind of society lifts up boys as divine creations, and then abandons them once they are no longer useful? What does it mean that a love once immortalized in poetry now only survives in coded lines and half-burnt scrolls? There's a line in an old Ottoman song once sung quietly during spring feasts by candlelight. Do not mourn the nightingale once its song fades, mourn the silence that follows. The silence. That's what remains. It's in the way textbooks refuse to mention the male beloveds of the court, in the way museums avoid portraits that depict affection between men, in the way modern historians argue whether to call it love or simply power dynamics. But to reduce these boys to victims or mere playthings is to miss the most haunting truth. Many of them loved back. They weren't always passive, they weren't always helpless. Some navigated the system with grace, using their beauty as leverage, their charm as currency. Some manipulated the affections of powerful men to rise through the ranks. Some, like Tahir and Tib, risked everything for something real. Not political favour, not protection, but intimacy. And that makes their erasure even more cruel, because it wasn't just their presence that society erased. It was their agency, their emotion, their voice. So what happened to them? After the fall of the Yamak system, many of the boys who'd grown up inside the palace walls disappeared into obscurity. Some were forced into heterosexual marriages to restore normalcy. Others became provincial administrators, far from the capital's judgmental eyes. and many, too many, simply vanished from the record. The empire itself didn't last much longer. By 1922, the Ottoman Empire was formally dissolved. The Republic of Turkey rose from its ashes, ushering in a fiercely secular nationalist era. The harem system was abolished. The palaces were repurposed. The new nation wanted to look forward, and that meant cutting ties with what it saw as decadent, shameful, or embarrassing. The male beloveds? They were left behind with the turbans and the calligraphy. But even in the modern era, traces persist. In literature, in art, in memory. Writers like Reşat Ekrem Koçu, in the 20th century, hinted at the old ways in their encyclopedic works on Istanbul's past. International scholars dug into Ottoman archives and discovered the names of boys once described as sunrise in human form. And in recent years, artists and filmmakers have begun reclaiming the imagery, not to romanticize it, but to reveal it. Because that's what this story demands. Not admiration, not judgment, but reckoning. To see the Yamaks for who they were. Children thrust into a world of luxury and expectation, trained to perform affection, to display beauty, to survive through compliance, and yet still they felt, still they dreamed, still they loved. And they remind us of something important, that even in the most controlled, rigid societies, even in systems built to suppress, love doesn't disappear. It hides, it adapts, it survives in glances, in poems, in resistance. Tahir and Tib, whether myth or memory, stand as symbols of that endurance. Their story of captivity turned to connection, of escape turned to devotion, cuts through centuries of silence. We may never know exactly how their tale ended, but we know why it matters, because their love was never supposed to exist. And yet, it did. And that's the truth empires fear the most. Not war, not rebellion, but passion that refuses to die. So what do we do with this history now? We remember it. We speak the names no one else will speak. We look at the paintings others glance past. We read between the lines of old poems, and we ask ourselves, who else have we forgotten? Whose stories were deemed too complicated, too shameful, too uncomfortable to preserve? Because history isn't just the story of the powerful. It's the story of those who were loved, even briefly. It's the story of a boy in silk robes, eyes lined with kohl, standing in the shadow of a throne, unsure if he's a treasure or a prisoner, unsure if the man who smiles at him today will forget him tomorrow. It's the story of stolen youth, borrowed affection, and moments that glowed like lanterns before being snuffed out. It's the story of longing, not for sex or status, but for something eternal, to be seen, to be remembered. And now, we remember. We remember Tahir and Tib. We remember the nameless boys who sang in the palace courtyards, wrote secret verses in the margins of scrolls, who disappeared before their time. We remember them not just as figures of history, but as people. People who felt, people who endured, people who loved. And in doing so, we restore not just their stories, but their dignity.